June 2022, Mexico. Residents of Monterrey take to the streets in protest. Due to an abnormal drought, the government had to limit water supply to homes to just 6 hours a day for millions of residents. Water, water, water. People were begging for it. And then suddenly it started to rain in August. It seemed like all the troubles were finally over, but things didn't turn out as expected. The rain didn't stop, it kept getting stronger. All of Mexico was flooded. As a result of the floods, more than 1,500 homes were destroyed. 13 people died. And to help others survive, they even had to mobilize the army. But the scariest part is that this case is not unique. The number of floods in the world is increasing, there are more and more deluges, and they are claiming the lives of thousands of people. And new UNESCO data indicates that in less than half a century, a great global flood could happen again. Floods are one of the most unpredictable natural disasters. You can be sure that there won't be a volcanic eruption in your region simply because there isn't one nearby. But floods can occur anywhere if there's an ocean, river, or even a small lake nearby. And most cities in the world are located near bodies of water or artificial reservoirs. There are indeed many factors that can cause a flood. For example, these can be natural disasters. Myanmar is a country in Southeast Asia that is geographically vulnerable to almost all types of natural hazards capable of causing floods. These include tsunamis, earthquakes, and landslides. Despite this, the people of Myanmar were not prepared for it. When in May 2008, Cyclone Nargis struck them and caused a flood. A 4-meter wall of water, moving at over 200 kilometers per hour, crashed into the densely populated Irrawaddy Delta region, where local residents were engaged in rice farming. In satellite images taken before and after the disaster, it is evident that the rice fields are flooded, and the trees and buildings have completely disappeared. They have been replaced by piles of rubble. The government has reported that the official death toll stands at over 22,000 people, and 41,000 are considered missing. However, other sources claim that up to 100,000 people died during the disaster. But it is not only hurricanes that can be dangerous, even ordinary wind can pose a threat. In the Netherlands in 1953, an ordinary cyclone caused a strong surge in the North Sea, which in turn broke through the dikes in the south of the country. As a result, about 1,800 people died, and more than 70,000 were forced to evacuate. This event was called the Zeeland Cataclysm. Stories like these show that poorly constructed dikes also pose a significant threat. And this is not the only flood caused by authorities. For example, the government claimed that deforestation in China's Henan province was carried out in accordance with the law. However, some environmental organizations stated that the scale of deforestation exceeded reasonable limits and was changing the landscape. And dense forests serve as a natural barrier for water. It is believed that because of this deforestation in 2021, heavy rains caused floods. As a result, more than 300 people died and tens of thousands were evacuated. You can't be sure that logging in your region is happening legally. Moreover, hydroelectric power plants within your city also pose a danger. In 2015, in the Brazilian city of Minas Gerais, a large amount of toxic waste spilled from a hydroelectric power plant into the Doce River, causing the water level to rise. The river not only overflowed its banks, but also became poisonous. 17 people died and more than 50,000 were forced to leave their homes. But the main factor causing floods is, of course, heavy rainfall. One of the largest floods caused by a series of heavy downpours occurred at the beginning of the 20th century in the western United States. At that time, the Great Miami River overflowed its banks and began flooding the city of Dayton, Ohio. Later, this would be called the Great Dayton Flood. At first, the residents did not panic, since a modern system of dams and levees had been built around the city at that time. But it was impossible to stop the force of nature, and soon there was so much water that the dams could no longer hold it back. In just 3 days, 18 billion tons of water fell on the state of Ohio. Some animals, unable to withstand the current, ended up in the most unexpected places. One journalist saw a pig on the second floor of a women's lingerie store and a horse near the cashier's desk at the National Bank. Yes, it might sound funny, but in reality, the disaster looked terrifying. Some animals that were good swimmers not only saved themselves, but also helped people. For example, dogs would bring food and water in baskets to those who had not yet reached a safe place. Horses and donkeys were used for evacuation and transporting goods. One farmer led a cow up to the second floor. When the first floor was flooded, his family couldn't evacuate for a long time, but they didn't starve. They survived thanks to the milk. As a result of the flood, about 145,000 people died, and more than 3 million lost their homes and property. The water receded only after several months. As you can see, surviving a flood is extremely difficult. And the scariest part is that very soon most of us will likely have to face this disaster. But will you personally have a genuine chance to truly survive this challenging ordeal? Just take a look at this eyewitness video where a flood sweeps away the iconic New Honeymoon Hotel in Kalam in a matter of seconds during last year's monsoon rains in Pakistan. In the summer, almost all the rooms were occupied and the hotel had a large staff working there. And in the end, in the catastrophe, 0 people died in the hotel. Before the water reached the building, all guests and staff were evacuated. If your city authorities know about a possible flood in advance and evacuate residents to a safe place, you have a 100% chance of survival. But unfortunately, this natural disaster is usually unpredictable. And if your house starts to flood, you'll have to rely only on yourself. First of all, you need to get to higher ground. If you live in a 2- or 3-story private house and have at least a little time, if possible, take all your important belongings upstairs. Completely turn off the electricity in the house because household appliances in water can cause a short circuit. It is best to wait out the flood on the upper floor or on the roof, but only if you are sure of the strength of your house. Ma Thet Tar Aung, who survived that terrible flood in Myanmar with her family, at first wanted to wait out the disaster at home, but the wind began to shake the building strongly, so they set off to a relative's house by motorboat. Its walls were stronger. If you don't have a backup option, run to the nearest multi-story buildings or shopping centers. At that moment, Thet Tar came up with a good idea. She found empty plastic bottles and handed them out to her loved ones so they could stay afloat if they ended up in the water. And when the girl was swept away by the current, it was the bottle that helped her not to drown. But at some point, she lost it and began to choke. Then Thet Tar grabbed onto the nearest coconut tree, and that's how she managed to survive. If you think that getting into a car and driving as far away from the flood as possible is a good idea, take a look at what happened to large SUVs during a flash flood in Utah, in Zion National Park. This video was filmed by an eyewitness who barely managed to get his family to higher ground to escape the flood. His camera captured someone else's car with people inside being swept away by the current. But even if you manage to escape, know that it's not over yet. After the water recedes, you need to wait for an official announcement from the authorities before returning home. At the same time, you should also follow a few more rules. Do not travel on flooded roads. Stay away from downed power lines and watch your step before taking a step. Debris, including broken glass and nails, may cover the ground after a flood. When you return home, throw away all food that has come into contact with dirty water. Clean and disinfect everything that got wet, as the flood will bring with it many bacteria. But the scariest thing is that you might not even need this advice. If humanity faces another great flood like the one that became the stuff of legends, survival will be nearly impossible. One of the 2 largest floods in human history began in much the same way as the disaster in Mexico. From 1928 to 1930, China also suffered from a severe drought, which was followed by a harsh winter with heavy snowfall. In March, the snow began to melt, and the situation was further complicated by spring rains and the summer monsoon season. The water levels in the local rivers began to rise rapidly. For example, in the Yangtze River, the water level rose by 70 centimeters in just 1 month, even though only 30 would have been enough for the river to overflow its banks. Mass deforestation once again played a significant role. Due to the lack of trees, the water quickly reached the city of Nanjing, which was then the capital of China. The current was so strong that the flood protection systems could not withstand it. especially since at that time such systems in China were quite primitive. And even if the dams had been in good condition, they likely would not have been able to hold back this flood. So the hydraulic structures that protected the riverside houses stood virtually no chance. As a result, the wave not only destroyed the homes of local residents, but also washed away the entire summer harvest and huge reserves of grain. Famine began. People were forced to eat tree bark and weeds, and some even resorted to cannibalism. There were recorded cases where families sold their children in order to survive. But even that was not the last cause of death after the flood. The sewage systems were destroyed and filth mixed with the water, which already contained countless microbes. People began to fall ill with deadly diseases such as dysentery, typhoid fever, and even cholera. And because people who had lost their homes were forced to become refugees, they began to spread infections further across the country. Soon, measles and smallpox were added to the list of diseases. It seemed things couldn't get any worse, but the flood also caused a surge in the mosquito population, since bodies of water are the perfect environment for them. This led to an outbreak of malaria. It was precisely the diseases associated with the floods that caused 70% of deaths among rural families and 87% of deaths in refugee camps. The 1931 flood in China is considered one of the deadliest natural disasters in history. The total number of deaths reached 4 million people. It's terrifying to even imagine that something like this could happen again in our time, although scientists suggest that a future scenario could be even worse. Remember I mentioned the flood in China? It's one of the two most horrific in history. In first place is the Great Flood, which is mentioned in the Bible, and it's quite possible that we may have to face a second one just like it. All of humanity should already be prepared for a new trial, with our survival at stake. After all, there are many indications that a massive flood will soon inundate most of the land on the planet. Scientists have calculated that the number of floods in the world has increased by 15% over the past 10 years. And a new study by the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has shown that the level of the world ocean is rising 25% faster than previously predicted. For millions of people, even a 1-meter rise in water level would be catastrophic. And here we are talking about as much as 5 meters. And another factor that could trigger a second great flood is global warming. Currently, the temperature on Earth is 1.5 degrees Celsius above normal. If no measures are taken, these figures will only continue to rise. UNESCO scientists have calculated that due to global warming, glaciers will begin to melt as early as 2050. Water could completely flood dozens of major megacities. Then the very existence of civilization will be threatened, just as it was during the Great Flood. According to the Bible, when God saw that people had turned away from faith and began to break the laws, he decided to punish them by sending a flood upon the earth. Almost all of humanity perished. Of course, scientists consider these stories to be myths, but why do remarkably similar and widespread legends about a catastrophic great flood exist in diverse regions such as Japan, the Middle East, the vast continent of Africa, and even the distant lands of America? It turned out that a truly massive flood did in fact occur several thousand years ago. The key to the mystery was found by geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman from Columbia University. They studied the so-called climate archive of the Earth, particularly ice deposits in Greenland, and concluded that about 10,000 years ago, the level of the world ocean rose significantly. And about 7,500 years ago, these glaciers raised the level of the neighboring Mediterranean Sea. So, in the area of the Dardanelles Strait, a gigantic waterfall most likely formed, with the power of 200 Niagaras, pouring for 300 days straight. It is likely that the level of the Black Sea, which had previously been essentially a lake, was rising by 0.5 meter per day. The population of the coastal regions suffered greatly. Evidence of this was found in Turkey. At a depth of about 160 meters underwater, researchers discovered traces of an ancient shoreline. Along it stretched the remains of wooden structures. This meant that the flood had destroyed entire settlements. It was precisely the catastrophe on the Black Sea coast that could have formed the basis for the biblical story of the Great Flood. And this could happen again. But which regions will be affected? According to preliminary calculations, water will flood the entire eastern coast of the United States, including New York, the north of Canada, and the coasts of Latin America. The desert in the center of Australia will turn into a huge salt lake. The most densely populated part of the continent will also end up underwater. Many European cities will be affected. London and Venice will disappear completely. The Amazon will overflow its banks and destroy Buenos Aires, the coast of Uruguay, and large areas of Paraguay. The vast Caspian Sea and the expansive Black Sea will both double in size. China and India will suffer less, but will still lose part of their territories. The Cardamom Mountains will turn into islands, and almost all of Russia's territory will vanish from the face of the earth. How terrifying! This is what the world map will look like after the glaciers melt. But even if your region escapes this fate, don't be too quick to celebrate. After the catastrophe, there will be a wave of migration and new deadly epidemics. All of this has already happened during the Chinese flood. Everyone on the planet will suffer in one way or another, and perhaps humanity will disappear altogether. There isn't much time left until 2050, but you can still make good use of it. For example, you could reinforce the walls of your house, join a protest against the construction of new factories or deforestation. At the very least, pack an emergency bag, right? Another one. And what will you start with? Write your answer in the comments.